Humanity's first interspecies war lasted 4 years. It was a turning point in our history, and the catalyst for major events including the founding of the UEE. It would also define the downtrodden character of modern Tevarin. On the morning of November 15th, 2541, Dr. Keller Lynch discovered the Elysium system and witnessed signs of the Tevarin civilization on the fourth planet, Calith. Believing that it should be government dignitaries and diplomats that make first contact, his only further action was to deploy a research drone to the planet. However, he lost contact with the drone. His scans showed several ships heading towards him, and so he returned to Centauri to avoid causing an incident. On Elysium 4, there were an indigenous species calling themselves the Tevarin. Though sentient and intelligent, they have not evolved to our level technologically. Recommend that we establish contact and bring them into the UPE. It is a wonderful opportunity to elevate the species into the modern era. The UPE reached out to the Tevarin, but they weren't interested in establishing diplomatic relations or even our technology. They were interested in our systems. And so our first interspecies war began as most wars do, over territory. The following year, Idris IV was captured by the Tevarin, the planet suffering a series of orbital bombardments. This marked the start of the First Tevarin War. Though most of the population fled before the Tevarin finally took the planet, a few hundred stayed. Rachel Locke, a local with no military training, organized the survivors for increasingly daring strikes to disrupt the Tevarin occupiers. The group became known as the Greys. At the central plaza of Tanis, now called Lost Quad, the Greys were almost extinguished. A raid on what would become the Tevarin planetary defense system went drastically wrong. Rachel Locke's second-in-command, Alana Shaw, and a large number of Greys were captured, executed, and displayed in the plaza to try and demoralize the remaining Greys from further operations. It did not have the desired effect. The war had raged into its second year. Although the UPE had managed to claim some decisive victories, the Tevarin were unrelenting, gaining ground in Centauri and pushing UP forces as far back as Tevarin. By late August 2544, High General Trevor Borland had grown impatient. In a strategy meeting with his advisors, he expressed a fear that by letting the battle lines equalize, he could see both sides becoming complacent and settling into a war of attrition. He wanted to unbalance the Tevarin, to challenge their expectations of how we had been engaging them in warfare. Over the next week, Borland, High Command, and his advisors sketched out the skeleton framework of what would become Operation Nemesis. On September 30th, 2544, UPE forces attempted to take back Idris IV. The Greys provided groundside intelligence for the attack. This operation went down in history as the Battle of Idris IV. As the battle against the Tevarin stepped into high gear, all non-essential projects were cancelled in order to focus on expanding the war effort and strengthening the naval fleet. The terraformation of Tayak was one of the projects included in the cutbacks. Colonel Ivar Messer, a brilliant and ruthless strategist, distinguished himself in the battle. He quickly became the pride of the military and the face of the war. The victory at Idris IV galvanized the populace, drove recruitment rates up, and built on the momentum to push further into the Tevarin systems. After the beginning of the First Tevarin War, the United Times decided to embed Renzo Wee with the 71st Carrier Wing to provide exclusive material on this historical conflict. For over 2 years, Renzo chronicled the successes and struggles, both personal and professional, of a naval carrier and its pilots, bringing the realities of frontline combat and military life to the public. For his award-winning series, Renzo would accompany the pilots of the 391st Squadron on torpedo runs against Tevarin capital ships, but it was this image that would become one of his most remembered. Captured during Operation Nemesis, the retaliators of the 391st were tasked with a daring run of one of the Tevarin's devastating planetary defense systems that were keeping the UPE Navy at bay. This shot, taken remotely via Renzo's camera, captures the moment where Alpha Flight opened fire. It has since been regarded as one of the iconic images of the war. The UEE Army managed to briefly seize the public consciousness during this period, when just as many battles took place across shattered landscapes than did in space. The Marines were at this time kept under the umbrella of the Army's command structure. Fueled by the never-ending stream of stories and vids of daring pilots, recruits flocked to the Navy's stations to sign up. Even before the draft, the Navy's enlistment numbers had barely dipped. Squadron 42 was founded during the First Tevarin War. As the war began to swell, the military feared that the conflict in the west might embolden a Jan attack in the east, and thus instituted a draft. Aegis grew to prominence as a manufacturer of military spacecraft during the First Tevarin War. Favoured by Ivar Messa, their orbital bombers grew to public prominence after his infamous victory on Idris IV. During the war, Persei-based U-Park developed massive magnetic coils designed to weaponize solar electromagnetic radiation. However, the project was a failure. Over on the Tevarin front, the Norl highly trained Tevarin infiltrators and saboteurs were known to deploy troops stealthily onto the hull of the massive and seemingly secure capital ships. They would breach the ships and wreak havoc inside. There are several documented cases where a Tevarin dropship loaded with Norl successfully took down an entire naval capital ship. The fear of Norl loomed over every UPE ship throughout the war. Whispers of Norl ferocity drove captains to double, even triple their guard, even while flying through secure space. The Norl made use of an infamous boarding craft known as the Prowler. The Speria today offer a reproduction model. The First Tevarin War concluded in 2546, with humanity capturing, colonizing, and renaming the planet of Calith to Elysium IV, modern-day Jalan. Ivar Messa, now promoted to commander, brought the captured Tevarin leader to the UPE floor. With this act, the war was unequivocally ended. Ivar Messa rode the popularity of his victory to become High General, claiming the tribunal to be an outdated system, and cultivating a fear of the Jan. Messa proposed the creation of a single new office with the title of Prime Citizen. Upon election as the first and last Prime Citizen, it wasn't long before he restructured the government into the new UEE, the United Empire of Earth, and anointed himself Imperator, ushering in an age of unprecedented expansion and colonization. Idris IV was then officially recognized within the UEE. The Governor's Council named the planet after famous freedom fighter Rachel Locke. The displaced Tevarin populace were assimilated, willingly or not, into the culture of their conquerors. Initially forbidden from living on the planets they evolved on, many cite that frustration as being one of the main factors in Korothal's call to arms that led to the Second Tevarin War. Meanwhile, the Tevarin military was scattered to the far corners of the universe. Confident in our absolute victory, we considered the Tevarin threat completely neutralized. We were, however, wrong. The Tevarin also left the Cabal system at this time, though it had not yet been discovered by the UEE. The study and use of the Prowler's air shields unlocked vast technological advances in human development, many of which are still in daily usage today. 12 years later, in 2558, a noteworthy quantum obelisk computer analysis of infantry actions during the First Tevarin War resulted in a flurry of changes to organization and tactics, chief among them the need to disassociate the ASO from the Army's command hierarchy. The ASO was reorganized into the core of a third spatial service. From this point on, the Marines would act fully independently of the Army. A number of smaller Navy organizations, including the Space Combat Team and the Naval Future Weapons Office, were rolled into the newly christened UPE Marines.